Get started. So thanks again. My name is Nikita Patel, and I oversee news partnerships at Twitter. This panel is all about breaking news, social news gathering. The hashtag for this panel is #ONA15BN. So feel free to ask us questions there so that we can address them during the conversation. We're changing the format of this discussion a little bit because we would rather have a conversation with you than just us up here. So we're going to chat for about half of the session and then open it up. So let's get started. With me today, I have Andy Carvin, who's editor-in-chief at Reportedly, and Mandy Jenkins, who's news director at Storyfl. And today we're going to discuss a myriad of stories, techniques. We're going to talk about everything from Charlie Hebdo to Ferguson to the Refugee Crisis and the Hajj Stampede. As you know, news in 2015 has largely folded on social media, and newsrooms of all sizes have been working through different challenges and workflows of breaking news and social news gathering. Ever since Arab Spring, newsrooms have mobilized and processes have changed. Some newsrooms have very specialized units specifically for social news gathering now, or they use organizations like Storyfl to help with mining and verifying social content as well. So in this session together, we're going to cover war stories. We're going to talk about workflows, best practices, ethical dilemmas, and we're even going to, like I said, we're going to switch the format up. So we're going to chat here for a bit, and then we want to have a conversation with you. So we do ask at that point that if you have questions to line up in the middle, so you'll have a mic. And if you can actually ask questions and not statements, that would be just really helpful to keep the flow of the conversation tight. Since we have a lot to discuss today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues here to kind of discuss a little bit about their organizations and what their processes are in terms of mining and vetting social content.
No, please go right ahead.
Oh, well, right. So, hi, I'm Mandy. I'm at Storyfl, and for those of you who might not know us or haven't had the pleasure of getting a shot at our booth yet, we're a social news agency, and my team, I have a team of about 25 journalists who are located all over the world, and using a combination of technology, but also good old-fashioned investigative journalism skills, we're essentially scanning the world for kind of the blips in the system that tell us that a story is breaking somewhere, and then as soon as we're seeing that happen, we're digging in to find those sources that are on the ground. So identifying eyewitnesses, identifying the players that are acting within these stories, and then once those eyewitnesses are doing things like sharing photographs, sharing videos, passing along facts of what they're seeing, we're working to verify those and getting in touch with those people so that we can be asking them a little bit more about the story. We're going to be verifying to make sure that those videos and photos happen where they said they did, when they said they did, what the source's connection to all of this is. And then we're also talking to them about copyright clearance. So we're getting those cleared so that we can work with news organizations of all sizes to get that from eyewitness into publication as soon as possible, because as we were just saying, with the kinds of stories that have been unfolding on social, not just this year, but for the past 5 years, really, often the first source and the best source is not going to be a journalist. They weren't there for it. The people who are there for it, who are living that experience, are the ones who are the closest to the story, and we see ourselves as very much connecting in with them. And in terms of the verification aspects of things, and I'm sure we can get into a little bit more details later, there's a lot of different ways that our team's going to be doing stuff like that, and hopefully some ways that your newsrooms are doing this too. Everything from saying, okay, I can spot a landmark here. There's a minaret in the background, and I see this red building, and then there's this roof. Going into things like Google Earth and finding that exact spot. Looking up past weather reports of saying, was it raining in this part of the world at 11 a.m. today when this was supposedly taken? Just doing all of these little fact-checkings of things to say, does this all add up? Does this all make sense? Who is this person and why were they here? What's their agenda, too? And thinking about things like that so that we can give a full package of what we know is happening on the ground and what's happening with this piece of content to the newsrooms that we're working with so that they can do their job and give it to their readers.
And so I'm editor-in-chief and founder of Reportedly, which is a startup venture that launched just about 9 months ago. that focuses on covering global news, mostly through the lens of social. And I say mostly because there is no story out there that plays out solely through one medium. At some point or another, it's going to cross over to others. And so we tend to focus on how we can dig into stories that are being expressed by communities of interest online around the world, and interacting with them where people are most comfortable to be talking, when they're most comfortable to be talking. And so we don't make any assumptions that people are going to come to our own platform or our own website to share their stories with us. And so basically our office hours are on Twitter for about 18 hours each day. My team, which is spread out over across 10 time zones, digs deep into a number of stories, specifically, again, global news. We've spent much of the year focusing on the refugee crisis, but we've also covered everything from Charlie Hebdo to the Nepal earthquake to Ferguson and other civil rights issues here in the US. We don't consider ourselves a breaking news venture, and which is funny because we're often described that way. And this may sound like BS semantics, but bear with me for a moment. We really try to focus on being real-time news rather than breaking news. And the difference between that is that there are plenty of news organizations out there that have the resources and the capacity to be first, or to compete with others of similar sizes to be first. Whereas we want to be able to go deeper into a story to understand the people that are involved, the context of the situation, and how it impacts the rest of us. And so in many ways, when you come to our Twitter feed, for example, it feels more like rolling news coverage that you might get on public radio, or another type of news broadcast where we're trying to analyze what's happening in different places. So while we will acknowledge stories are breaking, we're not racing to be first. I would rather have my team sign off for 30 minutes, 40 minutes to figure out what's going on and let the public know that we're going to go deeper in this, but we're not going to drag out a conversation online because we honestly don't know what we're talking about yet. I think it's very important as a news organization that focuses on social to be very transparent about what we know and what we don't know and why. Because often you'll see in breaking news situations, you don't have any sense whatsoever of where the journalists are getting their information from. Like they might say something as vague as law enforcement sources. Law enforcement sources are often the worst excuse for a source because you can, if you make a mistake, you can hide behind this, whatever this huge monolithic entity of law enforcement sources are. Whereas in reality, you're dealing with networks upon networks of sources, sometimes working at competing interests, whether it's related to a police story or related to Syria. And so we purposely take our time with these stories to sort everything out and make sure we can give as broad a story as possible. I consider my team to be social media natives in the sense that they think of the communities that they participate in as their communities and not ours. So we don't pretend to own a slice of Twitter or a slice of Facebook. I mean, yes, we have presences there, but we feel like we're acting as guests in these communities and that we have to give back to those communities as well. And I think by having that kind of relationship with the public, it allows us to interact with more people on the ground who want to share information with us and help us figure out what's going on. And so it's very much this reciprocal process of sharing information. And I mean, the greatest currency on social media is always generosity, whether it's of information, of skills, experience, and that's what we try to tap into.
I think one thing to add to that is tools as well. We all use a myriad of different platforms and tools that deliver us with information and signals to help us kind of look at different forms of content and verify things. So I'd love to talk about that really quickly too. We've mentioned Google Earth, you mentioned obviously Twitter. I love that you said Twitter office hours, it makes me happy. You know, obviously a lot of journalists use TweetDeck and have lots of different columns and lists and things set up with that. I personally am addicted to Data Miner. I'm not even in a daily newsroom anymore. With my role working with newsrooms, I tend to help them with social news gathering and work with them on projects. But I have Data Miner in my TweetDeck, and it still is such a wonderful service of notifying me of things. So I'd love to kind of hear what tools you guys use to help inspire everybody else.
Sure. So a lot of what we do is actually built in-house. We have, I think, the best product team in the business, and it's a great thing about being in an operation like Storyfl, where technology is such a part of our journalism, that we can work really, really closely with our product teams, and they are focused on building tools that really work for us, and then we can then start to give some of that out to our clients, to our newsroom clients who also want to use some of those. So we have some pretty interesting things that we work on, and actually something we really take advantage of that I'm surprised I don't hear more about in other newsrooms is using Chrome extensions. Everything we do is inside of Chrome, and our product staff is constantly making extensions to shorten our workflows all the time, whether it's things like translations, it's things like getting copyright clearance language in different languages that we could be sending to people. So basic things like, oh, Chrome, it's got everything, it turns out. And obviously TweetDeck, we can't live without it. So please don't ever take TweetDeck away from me, Nikita.
We have a similar philosophy in the sense that Chrome extensions can really be an extraordinary way to dig into a whole variety of stories. And so early on in the process, we basically shared our favorite Chrome extensions with each other and put together a package that we could all have on our desktops. And so we can all be sharing the same extensions and sharing bookmarks of new things we're discovering. And so we don't have a product team yet. We're still very small. There are just 6 reporters on the team right now. And so we tend to rely a lot on free and open source tools available, and it allows us to do the vast majority of our work. But at the same time, I think in many cases, the best tool that we interact with are the people who follow us on Twitter and follow us on Facebook. I still haven't found a tool yet that will notify us of breaking news stories as fast as our supporters do. They are basically an army of human censors, not censor as in, don't see this, block it, but censors as in sensing information. I mean, the classic example I always like to tell is there was a report of a university in lockdown because they thought there was a shooter on campus. I heard about it first through a source of mine in Libya who had gotten a text message from a cousin who happened to go to that school. And so it's not that this particular person had any direct connection with the university or the news business, but they felt it was important to share that with us to make sure that we didn't miss it. And while it may seem strange to try to rely on the public for identifying what's going on in the world, ultimately they're often the switches that trip first. They may not necessarily know what full context of the story is, but they recognize that something is taking place around them. And between a combination of talking with our own sources through various social media, by monitoring our collection of around 350 Twitter lists, which are all available to the public, by the way. If you go to Reportedly on Twitter and take a look at our Twitter lists, all of them are public. So for example, when we were covering the Burkina Faso coup over the last 2 weeks, you could be seeing the same stuff we were. And we're always playing around with new tools as they come and go, but ultimately it's still amazing how it boils down to relationships, cultivating sources, shoe leather reporting. None of that's going away. You just have to be thinking about it differently because the sources you're engaging with aren't necessarily standing there in front of you or accessible over the phone. And so you have to approach these things very differently now.
And to second Andy's point about lists, I mean, for everything that we're doing, lists are kind of the foundation for how we're kind of getting that initial alert system. Not just on Twitter, though Twitter lists are a huge part of what we do. Also Facebook lists, YouTube subscriptions, networks that are only used abroad, like things like Week and Talk Day. Things like that, they're hard to cultivate, but they're so important. It takes a lot of time to maintain those. Actually, lists easy to build, difficult to maintain. And we have a list for every country in the world, every state in the US, many, many ongoing stories, and those things are very hard to maintain. Though at the local level, that's obviously something that we can be doing in any newsroom. Who are the players in this community? Not just people who are journalists, not just people who are public officials. Who are the signals? Who are the people in that community who tend to know something first, and who are going to be the ones that we can look to, even if they aren't the first ones to be saying, hey, this is happening, there was an airstrike, there was an explosion. They're going to know someone who did. And when you have those sources, you can say, I'm seeing someone else say that this is happening here. Reach out via direct message or something like that to say, what do you know about this? Have you heard about this? You're living there. They're the ones that are on the ground there. And having those resources is just so critical.
And sometimes it's as simple as following someone's out replies. So like in Burkina when the coup happened and also when the coup ended, we started with, I don't know how many originally were on our Burkina list. It wasn't many, maybe 15 or 20 people. But as it became clear that a coup was in progress, what became most valuable for me wasn't what those people were tweeting to the general public. It was the at-replies they were having with people they knew on the ground. And so by paying attention to those conversations, we quickly, doubled, tripled the size of the number of people on that list. And so sometimes it's just using observational skills about how a conversation is playing out and seeing how hopefully some of these folks might be willing to engage you. And of course, that's going to vary. Sometimes people, they don't want to hear from journalists. But, and that's understandable given the certain types of stories playing out. But in other cases, there are people who are very eager to get the word out. And so all these various methods are simple ways of identifying who they are.
Exactly. It all goes back to, identifying sources, cultivating that relationship, and using the sort of journalism ethics then be able to shape your stories. I'd like to now talk a little bit about how social news gathering has just changed over the years. The landscape has greatly evolved, and then also newsrooms have evolved too. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, and then maybe how other newsrooms have evolved too, beyond your own.
Yeah, sure. It's funny because Andy and I have been working in this, I guess now it has a name of social news gathering or real-time news.
For better or worse, that's what it's called.
We've been working in this world a while, and a lot of you have too. Maybe you didn't even know that it had a name, but that's what you've been doing. And in terms of using social media and building networks and working within that, I think a thing that's changed is it's gotten both easier in the sense that I think more people understand it and kind of know their role in that ecosystem, not just journalists, but also the users themselves, I think, are becoming a lot more aware of kind of how they can be a part of this. But it's also a lot harder in a lot of ways too, because it's very complicated. It's a lot noisier than it used to be. I sometimes dreamily think back like, oh, do you remember when Twitter only had like this amount of people on there?
I missed 2008. I really did.
2008 was a good time,
year.
Yeah.
It was.
But then again, we have more voices now, and that's honestly what's more valuable. It's noisier. It's harder to sort through that noise. But there's certainly a lot more voices out there, and not just on Twitter, but on social networks that are emerging around the world. So now that there's just a plethora of information, I think that has had to shape a lot of what we do. And I think an important thing that I've seen change, whether through O&A and through the organizations I work with and for, I think something that has really changed for us is that we're becoming more aware of some of the ethical issues that we used to just kind of bulldoze our way through in the past. It's like, who cares about copyright? It only matters when it's our stuff. And things like, what about permissions? Or, verification. It sounds true. Let's just roll with that. And those sorts of things, you just don't see that happen as much anymore, and I'm happy about that. We're seeing a lot fewer people falling for fake Twitter accounts, and we're seeing a lot more people who are doing their homework a bit more, or at least asking around and saying, I'm going to wait for a second source on that. So seeing the industry change a lot with that has been really, really great. And we were just saying that we've had panels about engagement in social media and news here at O&A for several years. And every year I feel like we've grown by leaps and bounds in what we knew from the year before and the lessons we've learned since then and where the industry has come since then. And not just organizations like ours, we're kind of the outliers here. But local TV stations, local newspapers, bloggers, people working independently, huge news organizations, everybody is growing in leaps and bounds in how they're using these tools, and that's been a really, really great thing to see.
Yeah, I think there's the one constant that's been there this entire time is this subset of community, a community of communities of people who really care about telling stories and explaining what's going on and getting it right. The very first social news project I ever did was on September 11th, 2001. I set up an email list that day called September 11 Info. And for the first 24 hours, it was averaging 1 email a minute. And so, we didn't have broadband wireless then. We didn't have Twitter. But nonetheless, you had people using a listserv to question rumors that were being passed along by the media, such as an explosion taking place in front of the State Department or a fire on the National Mall in DC. There's always been an eagerness online for people to get to the truth. And what's really changed is social networks, as they've evolved, have made it easier for critical masses of people to come together. And the ubiquity of internet access, as it's expanded incredibly over the last few years, makes it easier to tell stories that would have been almost impossible to tell until a few years ago. So for example, it was in 2011 when Mali was under assault by ISIS supporting rebels, or back then it was Al-Qaeda supporting rebels. And most of the sources you would find related to Mali weren't in Mali. They were in France. They were expats living in Paris or elsewhere. And so it became very hard to find people on the ground in places like Timbuktu or Mopti or elsewhere to really figure out what was happening in real time. But flash forward to now, in the Burkina coup d'etat. Burkina is one of the poorest countries in the world with some of the lowest amounts of internet access. Yet we were getting information minute by minute in real time because there were people on the ground volunteering to essentially transcribe what they were hearing on the radio and keeping track of which radio stations had been overtaken by the coup and which ones were still independent. And that would have been impossible just as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. And so on the one hand, as Mandy says, there's a lot of noise out there now. But at the same time, I think at least enough people are getting better at their own news literacy skills, if you will, that we don't see the same fake photo circulating again and again and again, at least among these communities of folks that actually care about the story. And so it still happens, of course, but there definitely seems to have been an improvement in individuals' skills in how they engage the rest of us.
Yeah, oftentimes. And this community of social journalists, we're often policing things ourselves and verifying things in real time. We saw that during the Virginia shooting, specifically as that shooter was using different networks to post content. So speaking of that, and then where content lives, especially content that comes from eyewitnesses, let's talk a little bit about the most challenging aspects of social news gathering and touch on the difference between mining content from open networks such as Twitter to then closed networks such as WhatsApp and WeChat, and sort of what's happening in this space globally as well.
Yeah, that's been a challenge that I feel like I should have seen it coming, and it just kind of came out of nowhere. We've gotten so used to the idea that we want to search for something, we want to see what's going on. We have this wonderful availability of going onto Twitter and typing in some keywords and doing a little bit of geo searches, and oh, hey, there's some things coming out. It's easy enough. And that's happening here, but that is not happening in all the places and all the stories that we're monitoring. Increasingly, closed networks like WhatsApp, like FireChat, Weibo, those are going to be the networks where people are sharing information, and we don't have a way in. And actually, we have a very unique challenge that's different from what Reportedly faces, in that they're public-facing, they're interacting with people, they're an engagement group. Engagement is how they run, and for us, we kind of are the people who are tinkering behind the scenes, and for us to be able to get into those networks, it's a lot more difficult because it's about personal relationships. It's about, how do I get to connect with this person one-to-one inside of WhatsApp who has these photos? And an issue for us that comes from that, even aside from acquiring those stories and acquiring those sources, because it takes so much work to start meeting people and getting them to trust you, is also verification. There are things that can make it into these networks. They're being passed around. There's no way of knowing who originally put that in there. it's very hard to trace back. If they're like, oh, I got this from my friend, well, where did your friend get it? Well, oh, he got it from his friend, and it was passed this way and this way. I was thinking of the Tianjin explosion in China a few weeks ago. We had tons and tons of videos and photos coming from that we were getting on Weibo, and it was incredibly difficult for us to source them originally. And we were able to do things like verifying locations because it was a huge story. There was a lot of content out there for us to match things up against. But in terms of the original source, very, very difficult to find them.
Yeah, these closed networks like WhatsApp have, as Mandy said, really have a couple of major challenges to them. For one thing, there really isn't a discovery tool built within them, so you can't just show up on your app and say, hey, what's going on, guys? Who's talking about Yemen right now? It doesn't work. You have to, more likely the way I end up doing this is, I'll be talking to someone in Yemen on Skype, and I'll ask them, are you on any WhatsApp groups that I should be a member of? And they say, well, I'm on some, and we don't want you there, but maybe you can go join this one instead. And so it's they're invitation only. People create they're private spaces, and they want them to be private. And so it's becoming a whole new source cultivation skill of knowing how to talk your way into closed community chats like WhatsApp. And then you have this problem of, for lack of a better term, UGC laundering that takes place. Continuing with Yemen as another example, when the raids started in March, when Saudi Arabia began attacking Yemen, I started seeing people in Yemen circulating photos that I recognized from other situations. Someone, actually, it still goes on. Like I saw someone just a few weeks ago in Yemen share a photo that was actually from the highway of death in the Gulf War between Iraq and Kuwait, back in 1991. And they shared it as Yemen. The thing is, the guy who shared it on Twitter was in Yemen at the time. And so if you used a Discovery app to monitor geolocation, it would show that photo and it would be geotagged as being in Aden, for example. And so just because you're finding content that is geotagged, it doesn't mean that it's correct, because as content gets passed around from network to network, the metadata often gets scrubbed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. And so it's no longer good enough to just look at the metadata and say, that's all we need to know. Mm-hmm. It's a starting point for verification, but it's no longer the end point.
And I think the thing that's I think is going to be a challenge for our whole industry is that right now in the U.S., public networks are still what a lot of people are using, or quasi-public. It's not so easy to search Facebook as it is to Twitter, for instance. But around the world, and in emerging markets, especially places like India, most of Africa, South America, these closed networks, that's where everything is happening. People they've jumped over desktop for one thing to mobile, and they're also jumping over public networks to closed networks. And if we want to be in touch with the news and with the sources and the people in those areas, we're going to have to be interacting in that space, and we need to learn how to do that really quickly. Because we can't just jump into a WhatsApp group and be like, "Who's got explosion photos?" No one's
Hi guys,
gonna
I'm a
respond to
journalist.
that.
What's going on?
It's just not going to work that way.
Nothing worse you can do it.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's the same thing goes for public networks. The worst thing you can do is show up in a community of people online and say, "Hey, I'm a journalist. I saw that you're a witness to some people getting blown up. You want to talk to me?" You really have to put yourself into the mindset of folks who've just experienced something very, very traumatic and difficult. And it's so much easier if you build these relationships over time by getting to know first responders, getting to know human rights groups, getting to know dissidents, that when the shit hits the fan somewhere, someone's willing to have a conversation with you, and it doesn't feel like you're parachuting in to exploit their information and then head back out to your nice little office.
Exactly. Learning to be a little sensitive in those situations goes a long way in terms of cultivating those sources. And that actually goes into my next topic of discussion. And I'd love to talk a little bit about how we as journalists deal with, trauma and harassment too in these situations. Oftentimes people are flocking to us for information and harassing us in different circumstances. And then we're so entrenched in stories as they're unfolding and gathering news and information, we as human beings don't get to react to things in real time. I often have a delayed reaction to news and things like that. So how do you guys kind of broach these things?
it's interesting that for the panel yesterday, if you guys went to the keynote on online harassment, it brought back a lot of feels because the jobs that I've done in social journalism, I've been subjected to so much more, whether it's the vicarious trauma and the kind of elements of seeing troubling content, but also things like harassment. I mean, I think I was treated better when I was a reporter than I ever was as a comment moderator, as a social media editor. I mean, horrible, horrible things being said and done in that kind of space. And social journalists have some pretty unique challenges around that. And vicarious trauma in particular is an issue for my team, and a lot of teams really, but my team has a lot of journalists that are all over the world. They're usually the first ones to see a video. They're the first ones to see a photo. I mean, they're getting to it before I am. I would love to shield them from a lot of things. A lot of my staff, they're fairly young too, so not all of them have had to experience this before, so they're being confronted with something that they're not necessarily that comfortable with. So for us to be able to get in and say, okay, well, there were beheading photos. We've seen these things happen. It's something that we know we're going to have to deal with, and it's very difficult. And it's about building a community that's safe, not only just in our office, but for them to have their own spaces to go to kind of recover from that along the way, and to recognize in themselves that this is something that they need to be paying attention to. It can be really difficult. And the thing that can be, I guess, somewhat jarring out of that is that they don't even always know when that's going to happen. When you think of things like the Virginia shooting, when autoplay videos that are popping up in your Facebook newsfeed, they're popping up on Twitter. No one knew what they were getting into when that happened. And that's something my staff faces all the time, but people like my mom saw that video and she was horrified. And she texted me, she's like, "You guys have to see these things every day? This is horrible. This is the worst thing I've ever seen." She's like, "I'm never going to get this out of my head." I'm like, yeah, this is really bad. And I think this was something that not only end users were kind of experiencing that for the first time, but also journalists who don't usually do that too. And so it was kind of interesting to sort of see how other people were responding to the things that are issues we've had to deal with internally for a while. I feel like that story kind of blew vicarious trauma out into the open, where people were really talking about it a lot more.
Yeah, there's a confluence of things that have come together over the last couple of years that I think, thankfully, is bringing this notion of vicarious trauma out into the open. Back in 2011, when I was covering the Arab Spring full time, there was a small community of us, literally just a handful of people that were really spending their entire days focused on mining social media and cultivating sources that way. And we saw some pretty awful stuff all the time. And sometimes it wasn't the stuff you saw, it's the things that didn't happen. Like, there was a period of time where the thing that I would fear the most was silence on a Twitter feed. Because I've known a number of sources who 5 minutes earlier were tweeting to us and having a conversation with, and they got killed. And it's silence. People who've live streamed and gotten killed while streaming. A lot of horrible things take place in real time online. And let's say you're a combat reporter at a mainstream news organization. They'll drop you in for a set period of time. You'll be there for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, but whatever it is, there is a limit. And then they make you get the hell out of there and you go sit on a beach or do something to unplug. And they're still messed up, very, very messed up from a lot of the things they see. With us, we don't have the visceral experience of seeing it and smelling it directly ourselves, but we can't separate ourselves from it. There's, like, on my team, there are 6 of us. I can't afford the luxury of saying, it's been a really rough summer having you watch all of those Yemen videos. I want you to switch to lifestyle for the month. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so it's become so important for our team to recognize each other's triggers, and which can be hard to do when you're working virtually and you're having conversations almost exclusively through typing. It's often only when we switch to a Google Hangout and see the look on someone's face that we realize that we've got to stop right now and talk through what we just saw. In the case of the Virginia shooting, in many ways that culminated what's really been an awful, awful summer in terms of the types of stories we've had to cover. Yeah. And just seeing how the team reacted to it, I basically called the nuclear option and I said, we're shutting down tomorrow. We're all going to take the day off And so for one day, we didn't report. But if that's what it took for us to be able to spend time beginning to think about how we were processing all this, spend more time with our families, I think by taking those types of breaks and being able to reflect on what we've been experiences, hopefully makes us better journalists, but it helps keep us as healthy human beings as well. Mm-hmm. Because the potential for a burnout and the potential of being haunted by this stuff for life, it's almost impossible to avoid. And so it's often a matter of how you mitigate it instead.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think a thing that's challenging for us, not only can we not pull out of the situation, we can't just go to the beach the next day, but I think an element that's complicating is in social journalism, especially in a breaking environment, especially in a small team environment, you don't even necessarily tell yourself when the day is over. You're going to be working late into the night. That you get into your turn and you don't turn off, and you forget that maybe you should have stopped for a second. And it's not until they get home, they're sitting down, they're going to bed, and that's when things happen, when they don't have that support network around them. And again, working with the remote staff too, it makes it very, very difficult to do that.
Seeing staff work harder is often a sign of experiencing trauma. Mm-hmm. They think if they just keep going and going, they won't have to confront it. I spent almost 2 years on Twitter, 16, 18 hours a day, sometimes 7 days a week, dealing with the Arab Spring and the subsequent revolutions and wars that have started. And looking back on it, a lot of it was just a coping mechanism on my part. So I wouldn't have that moment of parenthesis where I had to reflect on what just happened and then be able to close that off and get back to the game. It makes things really difficult when you think about what happens when you have to take a break.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of breaks, we're going to end this conversation up here and have a conversation with you. So if you have questions, please come to the middle aisle. We have a wonderful volunteer with a microphone. So tell us your name, where you work, and your question. And again, remember, no statements, just questions, so we can keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Victoria Greene. I am with Business Wire here in Los Angeles. I work in our media relations department, so I kind of bridge the gap between the media and our PR clients. A question I have is going into kind of your verification process and taking it a step further from the online stuff you're seeing in the social discovery with people on the ground, and then moving forward to possibly communications or PR folks. I know crisis communications is nothing new, but a lot of times our PR clients are now facing the issue of combating what people are saying online with what may be true or false. So if you have any tips, tools, issues, fails that you've seen PR people do, or maybe some great success stories of how you've worked with someone from maybe a corporate aspect or even an organization with verifying something or working with them just to deal with a crisis.
No offense intended, but often the first warning sign I see during some sort of crisis is a PR person popping up in the conversation. That usually means it's much worse than we actually thought it was. And so it actually helps us do our jobs better. It's the type of stuff that my team covers, I don't think it applies because we're really focusing on human rights, global conflict, and the like. And I can't think of dealing with a PR person in the last 2 years on anything I've covered because it's just not the nature of the work we do. But I think what it boils down to for us is we want to get as close to authentic eyewitnesses as possible. And that means if when we talk to someone, anyone who seems like an intermediary, we try to get around them as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. Because either it may delay us or worse, send us in the wrong direction. And so it ends up being this cat and mouse game.
Got it. Mandy, anything from you?
Yeah, actually at Storyville we have 2 newsrooms that work side by side. We have our creative and brands newsroom and my newsroom that's doing more global news and human rights. And the work that they're doing is actually taking a lot of what we've learned in news and applying it in that space, working with agencies, working with brands, and getting into some things like background researching, finding sources. And it's a huge thing that could be very helpful in that crisis communicating world to be thinking about the same things we talk about in news. How authentic is this source? how do you know what their agenda is? Are they a real person that's part of this, or is this someone that's glomming on and trying to create trouble for the brand?
Exactly.
And so I think that social news gathering in the brand space, it's emerging, and it's really, really interesting, and it's not something that a lot of brands are doing themselves. And I think that that's exactly it. And it's using these same exact processes, though, but applying them in a different way of who are the key players here, what's their agenda, where are they located, what's the timing on this, is this suspicious? And also, of course, getting back to the basic customer service elements of, okay, now that we know that this is real, now that we know this person, maybe they do have an agenda, how do we address that? And it's getting back into the skills of just being open and transparent and communicating with them. But so much of it is just that research, of doing that homework, of examining all their footprints, and also being prepared, having source lists, having all of your go plan together. So yeah, I guess it's something I could probably talk for like an hour on cool things to do around that.
I will follow up with you.
It's an emerging space for real.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Terrell Jones. I teach a class in international journalism at the Claremont Colleges, about an hour east of here. We have some students, and forgive me if you've addressed this because I did walk in a bit late, but we have some students looking at social media and the refugee migrant crisis in Central Europe and coming from the Middle East. I wonder if you don't see these families with cell phones really.
No, in my experience, it's the exact opposite.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to ask, what is your experience with these? I'm just thinking of
we've been,
and has this played a big role in following this issue?
It's been enormous. It's even become a political hot potato because people who are anti-immigrant and anti-immigration will often say, "Oh, look at these Syrian refugees. They're not real refugees because they are carrying mobile phones. If they can afford a mobile phone, they don't need to come to our country." Bullshit. These people are carrying mobile phones to keep their families alive. And so there are these incredible networks of volunteers and refugees who've made it to places of sanctuary who help coordinate people further down the stream. So they know which place may be safer to cross, where smugglers may be exploiting people to the point that it's gotten dangerous. So much of what's taking place with refugees, there is a virtual paper trail where you can follow folks along the way, and which is why I think there are reporters out there like Patrick Kingsley from The Guardian, who's done incredible reporting following refugees along the road. It's a combination of shoe leather reporting, getting to meet these people, but also tapping into the networks where the information's getting shared.
And it's funny to kind of note too that, for one thing, yes, this is definitely being documented. Going back to that whole, these are parts of the world often where the desktop was not an issue. Everyone has gone directly to phones, and families are using phones that way. And as Andy said, these people they're not fleeing because they're poor. They're doctors, they're professionals, they're all kinds of people who are running for a reason that's not because they're poor. And their stories are being told largely through social, and for a long time, that was the only story. People weren't really covering this, especially in this part of the world. It was definitely more of a story in Europe than it has been here. We've been kind of talking internally at my company about how, we've been seeing these really troubling, really sad images of what's happening with these refugees along the way, the drownings, the problems with border control, the people being beaten by police officers, being taken advantage of by smugglers. And we've been seeing these horrible things for a long time, but it took a very startling photograph of a 3-year-old washed up on a beach to get the United States to say, oh, this is a thing? Yeah, this has been a thing for a while, and they've been telling their own story, and I'm really glad that this is something that people are paying attention to now, but their eyewitness accounts have been out there for quite a while, and I'm hoping we can continue to pay attention to those as a journalist.
Exactly, we should be paying attention to their stories versus having an image like that be the sort of trigger. I went home that day, and I have a 20-month-old son, and I hugged him so tightly and didn't let him go. But I should continue to appreciate him despite that photo, and we should continue to pay attention to the stories of these refugees.
Hi, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. My name's Alina Hartunian, and I collect UGC for the Associated Press. And I've got 2 questions for you. The first is, I've kind of encountered this more and more as these licensing companies like Viral Hog out there who kind of swoop in really quickly and grab, licensing deals with people who are shooting footage, and other people, will ask me about compensation for their content. I'm wondering what your, experiences have been with that, and also have you been able to use live streaming in your reporting, and how have you been able to incorporate that into your reporting?
Well, on the licensing front, my company does do video licensing. But for us, and actually we have a part of that separate unit that goes after more viral videos. That's kind of been the history of it for a long time, cats, babies, fun stuff like that. They get the fun job. They're not looking at pictures of Syria usually. But we were seeing in the news space where there is a lot more people who are going after news videos for exclusive licensing, and it's not something that we'd been doing for a long time, but now if we want to have access to that for our clients, we're having to have those conversations increasingly, more than I think we even did just a few months ago. That's definitely something that's happening a lot more. And in terms of when someone wants compensation, when they want to get into a licensing arrangement because they know they can get that, for a company like ours, we're not always going to be able to just throw cash at them. I don't have like a bank vault, Scrooge McDuck style, behind my desk that I can do that. But it's about having that conversation to say, okay, internally, what's going to be the end game value here? Is this going to be of use to our newsrooms? Is this going to be if this is the best video, if this is the video that everyone's going to have that's going to tell you what really happened in the story, then we're going to make that happen. We're going to get into an arrangement. We want to make sure it's fair to the uploaders. Obviously, they're the ones who are the ones who went through whatever that was that they saw, but they also deserve to be getting credit. They deserve to make money off of that if that's what they want. And yeah, so it's hard to balance it because you certainly can't pay everybody, and not a vertical video that's shot from a really far away and you can't see what it is. Maybe that's the only video, and maybe that's exactly the story that has to be told, and that's the difficult conversations that we have to be getting into, not just as a licensing agency, but as any newsroom. Of, if we need this, and this is the only way to get it, then let's go get it.
Yeah, for us, we really don't have to deal with it because, on the one hand, we're looking for people who are openly sharing information, and if there are folks who are looking for compensation or giving an exclusive to someone, we subscribe to things like AP photos and Getty photos and the like, and so we're more than happy to wait until they share it. We don't. It doesn't feel like an effective use of our time to be dealing with licensing when we really want to be focusing on telling the story. So that's just not part of the business we're in.
And honestly, most of the time, a lot of people, they're just, for one thing, they're kind of somewhat being assaulted by being in that situation to start with. But a lot of them, they just are like, yeah, great, credit, whatever. I just want someone to know that this is happening. And it's all part of the sharing ecosystem there, I guess.
Exactly, that's the number one thing. Money aside, I think news organizations forget to credit sources, and I think that's a huge unethical dilemma. And so again, regardless of whether you've paid for that content or not, you've got to be clear where the content came
Twitter,
from.
source, YouTube.
Exactly.
Come on.
Yeah. We've seen it time and time again. And when I go to a story or when I see a video clip that's not credited, I'm not going to believe it as a user. I'm not going to trust it. And so that's your credibility as a newsroom, Source those users that are sharing content with you. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Charlotte Halle from Haaretz newspaper in Israel. Listening carefully to what you've said today, and some of it has really struck me as not what we experience in Israel as far as news gathering goes. For example, when you've talked about building trust before you get people to speak to you, we don't seem to have that issue talking to Israelis or Palestinians. Everyone is very keen to talk to us all of the time. But there are other things you've said, for example, about verification, which are familiar to us. And I'd love to hear if you have got anything to say about the specifics of working in our region with Israelis and Palestinians, because so much of what you said doesn't seem to have rung true with me.
Yeah, our densest collection of Twitter lists have to do with the Middle East in one form or another. They're not mutually exclusive by any means, and so depending on the exact nature of the situation, we'll bounce around from list to list. I mean, like I think back to the Gaza war a year ago. You know, I remember watching on Twitter feeds as someone in Gaza reports a rocket launch, and then someone along the border sees it, and then someone, you know, 2/3 of the way to Tel Aviv reports the explosion on the ground. And there are so many people that are saying, oh, the sirens just went off and we're in the shelter. And so there are enough people who are using social to help piece together the basics of what's happening. But it's also been in my experience that more and more people in Israel and Palestine have started moving into the private networks, into the WhatsApps of the world, which makes it harder to penetrate. And of course, these are stories that have very strong opinions and motivations on each side, which just adds to the complexity of how you go about verifying things.
Yeah. And to that point, the verification of content from that region can be complicated by the fact that, yes, everyone does want to talk to you because a lot of them have an agenda.
Yep.
And it's getting to the heart of what that is. You know, it's a somewhat of a propaganda war, just as much as it is, you know, a real life struggle that's happening there. And, you know, not even just with the level of, you know, ISIS being great at propaganda, frighteningly good at it, but, you know, even at the lower level of, you know, I think back to the Gaza war last summer, people using old images from other places to be like, this is happening in my neighborhood.
Yep.
Why isn't anyone doing anything about this? The other side is doing X. And we're like, no, that's an old image. We've definitely seen that one around before. That one's made the rounds. You know, and then knowing that, yes, this person might be a good source for us to still have and to still have been around, but now we know that this person is maybe not someone we can always trust. And it's about finding those people that we can say, okay, well, you know, we can't necessarily believe everything you're saying, but it's good to know you're there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tommy Wright from the Monterey Herald newspaper in California. I'm curious, what are your protocols for issuing corrections, and would you ever delete a tweet?
Our process for corrections is to be as transparent and as quick as possible to acknowledge the correction and, whenever possible, explain what went wrong. And so, you know, we're open about everything else as we're on Twitter, and so it would be very hypocritical of us to do otherwise. And so even for fairly minor things, we'll jump back in and say, oh, I think we got this wrong, hold on for a second, and then we'll talk about how it happened. But fortunately, it doesn't happen too often. I've only deleted a tweet once regarding journalism, at least.
Go on.
Yes. The tweet that I deleted was a screenshot of the Virginia shooter, the video that he had posted via Facebook and Twitter. And it was during that 22-second gap where he's holding the gun on them and they don't realize that they're about to be killed. And at the time, I uploaded it to confirm that this video was something authentic because you could recognize the people in it. And as soon as it went out, I thought, oh shit. I just played into this guy's hands. He's pulling an ISIS on us. He wants the notoriety. And so while I still think there are lots of occasions where sharing graphic or disturbing images are appropriate, we're beginning to see more cases where sharing something plays into the propaganda or the sick mindset of some individual who's doing something horrible to someone or to society. And so, so for the first time ever, I decided to delete that tweet.
For us, you know, we're, and having worked in more traditional media and, you know, out in public a lot more, I've certainly had to face that a lot in the past. We have the benefit at Storyville of largely working internally and directly with clients, though, you know, we do communicate a lot openly on social media too. But our entire business depends on us being right. We would not have a business if we weren't correct. And speed, as much as it's important, it's not the biggest factor for us. Correct is our top priority, because without it, then we're gonna have to leave this business and start something else. So for us, I mean, obviously mistakes do happen. And obviously, for us, actually, the thing that it ends up being, if we do have to issue things like corrections, it tends to be something that happened with an uploader of, so I might have not told you the truth about this video. of, I didn't actually shoot this, it belonged to somebody else. So occasionally things like that. I'm not saying we don't ever make mistakes, but it's something that we do extremely rarely, and thankfully don't often do out in public.
Whereas in some ways it's beneficial for us to be so transparent about how we do things, because we can just say openly, you know, someone is telling us this and we have no idea if it's true or not.
Right.
And while some people can make the argument, well, you're a news organization, you know, you shouldn't be sharing information you haven't confirmed. Well, the problem is that the world doesn't surround you, it doesn't revolve around you. There are communities of people online who are in the millions who are sharing information with each other, often completely incorrect. And I feel like it's important for us to play a role in verifying or clarifying the news beyond our own personal platforms. You know, when I worked at NPR, you know, we didn't, or at least I definitely didn't wait for us to broadcast something just whether it was true or not. If I saw something that I knew to be factually incorrect on Reddit or whatever, I felt it was my journalistic responsibility to jump in there. And so it ends up becoming often a fairly positive reciprocal relationship where you can say, okay, we are taking this with a grain of salt, and you should too, but this is what people are sharing right now. What do you all know? And that helps us often get to the truth much faster than if we were keeping it to ourselves.
Absolutely. All right, I'm afraid time's up, sadly. But
We
if you'd
can't
like to
squeeze in two
stick around,
questions?
we're at time, sadly. Yeah. But please come to the front if you have questions. We'll keep the conversation going up here.
By all means.
Thank you. I'm sorry.